The Strait of Hormuz is still closed, one-fifth of the world's oil supply. Ships sitting idle, prices climbing. And this morning, Iran's foreign minister stood before reporters and said something that stopped diplomatic back channels cold. He said Tehran has no trust in the United States. Not low trust, not damaged trust, no trust. And then, almost as a warning, he added, Iran is prepared to go back to fighting. So here's the question nobody in Washington or Tehran seems able to answer right now. If both sides claim to want peace, why does every conversation seem to move them further apart? This is Friday, May 15th, 2026. And right now, one of the most consequential diplomatic standoffs of the decade is teetering on a knife's edge. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi made these remarks today in New Delhi, where he was attending a BRICS foreign ministers meeting. He spoke to reporters. He did not mince his language. He cited what he called contradictory messages coming from Washington, and said those contradictions have made Tehran genuinely uncertain about whether the Americans are serious about reaching a deal at all. The backdrop: a war between Iran, the United States, and Israel that erupted in February of this year. A ceasefire was announced last month, but it is fragile. Talks aimed at turning that ceasefire into something permanent have been mediated by Pakistan. And as of right now, those talks are suspended. Both sides rejected each other's most recent proposals just last week. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas once flowed, remains effectively shut to most commercial shipping traffic. This is not background noise. This is the main event. And if you want coverage that cuts through the noise and goes straight to what matters, subscribe now, because this story is accelerating by the hour. Let's build the picture carefully. The war began in February 2026. The reporting confirms that Iran and the United States and Israel became direct belligerents, a significant and confirmed escalation beyond what had been years of proxy conflict and covert pressure. The specifics of how the war started and what battles were fought remain beyond what today's article confirmed, so we'll hold those details for verified updates. What is confirmed: it happened, it was real, and it changed everything about how energy moves across the planet. Iran's response to the war, its strategic countermove, was the Strait of Hormuz. Araghchi's statement today clarified the current policy. Vessels can pass through the strait, but only those not at war with Tehran. Ships wanting to transit must coordinate directly with Iran's navy. The foreign minister described the situation around the strait as very complicated. That is a careful diplomatic phrase doing enormous work, because what it actually means in practice is that most of the world's major oil exporters, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, all route some or all of their exports through that narrow 21-mile-wide chokepoint. And right now, with the strait under Iranian naval authority, that corridor is transformed. It's no longer just a shipping lane, it's a pressure valve, and Tehran is holding it. On the ceasefire side, the US and Iran did announce a ceasefire last month. That much is confirmed, but announcing a ceasefire is not the same as building peace. And the gap between those two things is where diplomacy goes to die. The Pakistan-mediated talks have collapsed into what Araghchi diplomatically called difficulty. Not failure. He was careful to say it hasn't failed, but suspended. Both sides rejected each other's most recent proposals last week. The core issues blocking agreement: Iran's nuclear program and control of the Strait of Hormuz. Two of the most contested issues in modern international relations, sitting at the center of the negotiating table with no resolution in sight. And then this morning, hours before Araghchi spoke in New Delhi, President Trump told reporters that his patience with Iran was running out. And in a separate development that carries enormous strategic weight, Trump discussed the Iran situation with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Both leaders agreed Tehran must reopen the strait. The US and China, rivals on virtually every other geopolitical front, finding common ground on Hormuz is not a minor footnote. It is a signal. Iran is now facing unified pressure from the world's two largest economies simultaneously. Araghchi's response? Essentially, we hear you, we are prepared to talk, but not if you keep sending contradictory signals. Not if you say peace in one room and escalation in another. The gap between what both sides say they want and what their actions suggest has never felt wider. Iran says it's keeping the ceasefire to give diplomacy a chance, but it's also, in the same breath, saying it is prepared to resume fighting. Those two things cannot both be fully true indefinitely. At some point, one of them wins. Let's zoom out, because this is not just an Iran-US standoff. This is a story with tentacles that reach into every fuel tank, every shipping container, every government budget on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz is not just strategically important, it is structurally irreplaceable, at least in the short term. Before the war, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supply passed through it. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports, which power homes across Europe and Asia, move through Hormuz. So do massive volumes of crude from Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE. The UAE is already, according to a separate confirmed report today, accelerating work on an alternative pipeline project to route oil around Hormuz. That alone tells you something. Major regional players are beginning to plan for a world where the strait stays closed for a long time. When a corridor that large gets disrupted, the effects are not contained. Oil markets reprice. Shipping insurance rates spike. Import-dependent economies, especially in South and Southeast Asia, feel it in inflation. European gas markets, still fragile after years of supply volatility, tighten further. This is not hypothetical. This is arithmetic. Now layer in the nuclear question. Iran's nuclear program has been the unresolved epicenter of US-Iran tension for more than 2 decades. The Islamic Republic insists its nuclear activities are peaceful. Western governments and Israel have long disputed that. The war appears to have brought the issue to a new and more dangerous threshold. If a permanent peace deal must include resolution of the nuclear question, and Araghchi's statement confirms it's on the table, then the negotiations are not just about ending a war. They're about restructuring one of the most entrenched disputes in modern international security. And in the middle of all of this, Pakistan. Islamabad has stepped in as the designated mediator. It's a role that carries enormous complexity. Pakistan has its own fraught relationship with both the United States and the wider region. Managing a mediation between Washington and Tehran, while those two sides are publicly accusing each other of bad faith, is a diplomatic tightrope walked over an active minefield. What do you think? Can Pakistan bring these two sides back to the table? Or has the trust gap become too wide to bridge? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Araghchi's specific framing of contradictory messages is worth sitting with. He didn't say the Americans lied. He didn't say they broke a specific commitment. He said the signals are contradictory, which means either Washington has internal disagreements it hasn't resolved about what it actually wants, or it's using deliberate ambiguity as leverage. Either explanation is troubling, because you cannot negotiate a permanent peace agreement with a counterpart whose red lines keep shifting. Trump's alignment with Xi on the Hormuz issue, while simultaneously maintaining his own escalatory public posture toward Iran, is itself a kind of contradiction. Press Iran to open the strait, but also declare patience is running out. That is pressure from two directions at once, and it may explain exactly what Araghchi means when he talks about mixed signals. Here is what most people have missed. Iran's foreign minister was speaking from New Delhi at a BRICS foreign ministers meeting. BRICS, the bloc that includes Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and now several others. The same forum where nations have been actively building economic and diplomatic architecture outside the Western-led international order. Araghchi chose that stage, that platform, that audience. That is not a coincidence. That is a message. Iran is not just pushing back on Washington bilaterally. It is signaling to every country in that room that it sees a wider coalition capable of reshaping how pressure gets applied in this conflict. And that changes the leverage equation in ways that haven't fully landed in Western commentary yet. Step back from the communiques and press conferences for a moment, because behind every diplomatic stalemate, there are people living inside the consequences. Think about what a closed Strait of Hormuz means for a household in Pakistan, the country whose government is now trying to broker peace between the two sides, blocking the very shipping lane their own economy depends on. Pakistan imports petroleum. A rise in global oil prices feeds directly into fuel costs, into food transport costs, into electricity generation. The people least responsible for the decisions that closed Hormuz are often the ones who absorb the sharpest economic pain. In countries across South Asia and East Africa, economies that are heavily import-dependent and fuel price-sensitive, The indirect effects of this confrontation ripple through markets that have nothing to do with military strategy. A fisherman in Kerala whose diesel costs jumped. A transport operator in Nairobi recalculating his margins. A factory owner in Bangladesh watching his energy bill climb. These are not dramatic scenes from the front lines, but they are real, and they are happening. The ceasefire itself, however imperfect, brought a certain kind of relief. Not resolution, not safety, but a reduction in immediate military threat. The fear of that ceasefire breaking down is its own form of psychological weight, especially for communities that live geographically close to the potential flashpoints. In port cities around the Gulf, in shipping hubs dependent on Hormuz traffic, the question isn't abstract. Will it hold? Is tomorrow different from today? Iranian society is navigating something particularly complex. The country has been through sanctions, through proxy wars, through years of economic pressure, and now through open war. Araghchi's framing today that Iran is keeping the ceasefire to give diplomacy a chance suggests a leadership that is aware of domestic exhaustion with conflict. But the simultaneous message that Iran is prepared to resume fighting suggests that exhaustion has not translated into desperation. These are two very different states. Exhaustion can accept compromise. Desperation is volatile. The line between them, in a government negotiating under enormous external pressure, can be thin. On the American side, the public posture from President Trump, patience is running out, carries its own weight for people watching this from inside the United States. It raises a question that every military family, every voter with someone deployed near the region, every energy industry worker wants answered. What does patience running out actually mean in practice? Is it a negotiating tactic, a timeline, an ultimatum? The ambiguity is intentional, probably. But ambiguity in public messaging about an active ceasefire situation creates anxiety in ways that are hard to contain. And then there's Pakistan's people. Islamabad agreed to take on this mediation. That decision carries domestic political consequences. If the talks collapse entirely, Pakistan absorbs part of the reputational cost. If the talks succeed, it's a historic diplomatic achievement for a country that is often defined by its security challenges rather than its diplomatic ones. The weight of that responsibility sits somewhere in the background of every conversation Islamabad is having with both Tehran and Washington right now. This is what it looks like when geopolitics isn't abstract. When a foreign minister's statement in New Delhi about trust, about contradictions, about a very complicated situation, translates into decisions made by governments, markets, and families who didn't choose to be part of any of this. The ceasefire exists, but both sides just publicly rejected each other's proposals. Talks are suspended, and Iran's foreign minister just told the world his country has zero trust in its negotiating partner. If Pakistan cannot get both sides back to the table, what's the alternative mechanism? There isn't an obvious one. Trump's alignment with Xi on Hormuz signals that Washington is exploring multi-front pressure. But Iran's choice of the BRICS forum for today's statement signals it's preparing a multi-front response. And underneath all of it, the nuclear question hasn't moved at all. If the ceasefire cracks before a permanent deal is struck, the world does not return to where it was in January. The strait stays closed, the war resumes, and a geopolitical situation that is already without easy precedent gets significantly harder to contain. Step all the way back. What you're watching right now is a fundamental test of whether the post-ceasefire diplomatic architecture that was hastily assembled last month can survive contact with the underlying reality. These two countries do not trust each other. They did not trust each other before the war, and the war itself has deepened that distrust into something structural. The Strait of Hormuz is both the most concrete and most symbolic element of this standoff. It is concrete because its closure has measurable effects on real economies. It is symbolic because reopening it, which the US and China both now publicly demand, would require Iran to surrender one of its most powerful remaining forms of leverage before it has secured guarantees it believes in. Asking a country with no trust to give up its strongest bargaining chip first is not a diplomatic strategy. It is an ultimatum dressed as a request. The BRICS dimension of Araghchi's statement today deserves sustained attention. The bloc represents a significant share of global GDP, a majority of the world's population, and, increasingly, a set of parallel financial and trade mechanisms that reduce dependence on Western-led systems. Iran addressing that audience while negotiating with Washington is not a gesture. It is a positioning move. It tells Washington that Tehran does not see itself as isolated, that it has rooms to walk into that are not controlled by U.S. diplomatic architecture. For intelligence agencies monitoring this situation, the question of Iranian military readiness during the ceasefire period is central. Araghchi said Iran is prepared to return to fighting. That statement needs to be assessed not just as rhetoric, but as a real-time declaration of posture, what it means operationally. Whether Iranian forces have used the ceasefire to regroup, rearm, or reposition is something that analysts in Washington, Jerusalem, Riyadh, and Beijing are working through right now. The nuclear threat is perhaps the most consequential long-term variable. Any permanent resolution of this conflict that does not address Iran's nuclear program will not be accepted by the United States or Israel. Any resolution that demands Iran fully dismantle its nuclear capabilities without binding security guarantees in return will not be accepted by Tehran. The range of possible agreements is narrow. The trust required to execute any of them is, by Iran's own public statement today, essentially absent. Pakistan's mediation role has not officially ended. Araghchi was careful to say the process is in difficulty, not dead. That word choice matters. It leaves a door open, small and not well lit, but open. The question is whether either side has the internal political will to walk through it. Trump faces domestic pressures that make open-ended diplomacy with Iran politically costly. Iran's leadership faces its own internal calculations about what terms it can sell to its own population after a war. What to watch in the coming days? Whether Pakistan makes another formal approach to resume talks, whether the Trump administration shifts its public language from pressure to engagement, and whether Iran's naval posture around Hormuz changes in any observable way. Any movement on those three indicators will tell you more about where this is actually heading than any press conference statement. Right now, both sides are talking about peace while preparing for the possibility that peace doesn't hold. That is not unusual in diplomacy, but it is inherently unstable. And the margin for error, with a closed strait, an active ceasefire, and zero trust between the principals, is thin. The next move matters. A lot. This story is not settled, the ceasefire is not permanent, the talks are not resumed, and the Strait of Hormuz is not open. Every development in the next 48 hours could shift the calculation. What do you think happens next? Does Pakistan find a way to bring both sides back to the table? Or does this fall apart completely before a deal is ever reached? Drop your answer below. I want to know what you're thinking. And subscribe, because this is the kind of story where the update you miss might be the one that changes everything about how it ends.